For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal. The world is in turmoil, both economically and geopolitically. The war between Russia and Ukraine has meant that the uncertainty in financial markets as well as in big power relations has sent the world spinning into uncharted territory. The Indian subcontinent is no exception. So, how is India, the big power in the Indian subcontinent and in Asia, going to deal with the foreign policy challenges in the next couple of years? Is the subject of this week's Ask Nitin. I'm Nitin Gokhale. As I was beginning to say, that the world today does not know where it is headed. There is financial uncertainty, inflation is high in most big and small countries, and of course the reset in big power relations as well as amongst continents is making everybody nervous. Is it a throwback to World War I situation or pre-World War I situation, or is it something new? China wants to assert itself by its actions against Taiwan, as we have seen in the past 1 week or so. US is not backing off, and of course Russia continues to attack and continues to carry out its own operations in Ukraine as it has been doing since February. The after effects or the cascading effects of all this has meant that no country in the world is unaffected by the turmoil that has been unleashed by these events since February. The Indian subcontinent in particular has seen one country more or less collapse, its president forced to flee abroad under circumstances of fear and loathing by its people. And I'm talking about Sri Lanka, which is India's close neighbor in the south, which collapsed economically because of various reasons starting in 2004-05, and of course triggered by the economic uncertainty and the rising oil prices and rising inflation that made its economy unviable. Its foreign currency exchange ran completely dry, and finally its president, then President Gokhale Rajapaksa, had to leave the country lest the people attacked him. The situation is not as rosy as it is made out to be in countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Pakistan, which is also India's western neighbor, and smaller countries in Africa or in Latin America. But since we are confining ourselves to the Indian subcontinent, let's look at countries around India. India, by all counts, by IMF estimates, by World Bank estimates, and our own economists and the financial wizards who say, or the RBI says, that India will grow at least at 6.5 to about 7%, between 6.5 to 7% this financial year. It is the only bright spot in a world of gloom and doom as far as inflation and economic setbacks are concerned. But around India, there are countries which are very fragile. We've seen the collapse of Sri Lanka, as I mentioned. Nepal is battling its worst economic crisis. Its foreign currency exchange reserves are running low. And just about 3 days ago, Bangladesh raised fuel prices by 42% for diesel and 51% for petrol. Its highest ever raise in one go in its history since it was formed as a separate nation in 1971. So the countries are not in very good position. That will bring a challenge for India, being the biggest power in this region, as well as a country which is doing better than most other countries economically. How does India cope with these challenges? And it's not only about economy or collapsing economy or economies that are not doing well. These countries are also facing elections in the next 12 months. In December, Nepal is scheduled to have elections, general elections. Maldives and Bangladesh are slated to have elections next year in 2023. And of course, Indian general elections are due in 2024, summer of 2024. So, India's foreign policy challenge as the big power in the neighborhood is only increasing. Because as we saw in Sri Lanka, India tried to help Sri Lanka by extending almost $4 billion in grants, aids, loans, soft loans, everything. Tomorrow, if these other countries like Bangladesh, Maldives, and Nepal also need financial assistance or at least need stability, India will have a role to play. Bangladesh, of course, is a little different than, say, Nepal or Maldives. Bangladesh has had a great run as far as its economic growth is concerned. At one point in time, it had the highest GDP growth in the region, better than India in 2019-2020. But rising fuel prices and its inability to generate too much of foreign exchange for its own exchequer has meant that now Bangladesh is forced to go to IMF seeking a bailout or seeking temporary assistance of to the tune of about $4 billion. Now that brings in restrictions and conditions imposed by the IMF, which is perhaps why the fuel prices have been increased in Bangladesh. Nepal has very little by way of foreign exchange earnings except for tourism. And tourism, as we all know, was hit by COVID and the pandemic. And it has depended on help from China and, of course, India. So, India's role again in these countries is going to be high, it's going to be crucial in propping up these countries and not allowing them to collapse as perhaps other countries are or on the verge of being collapsing. The other challenge is that Pakistan is also facing economic hardship and we don't know what the consequences are. There could be unintended consequences. There could be temptations for Pakistani rulers and Pakistani army to launch a diversion by way of increasing the tempo of insurgency or terrorism in India or in Jammu and Kashmir. It might also strengthen its already ironclad ties with China, which is another challenge for India. And of course, we can't forget China, the big dragon in the tent, which is faced off with India in Ladakh and along the northern frontiers and is showing no signs of drawing down its troop strength or even allowing disengagement at the friction points in Ladakh, despite 16 rounds of talks between the core commanders. So that's the challenge that India has, that it has to keep balancing between how it deals with China, how it remains an effective member of the Quad, which consists of the US, the Australians, the Japanese, and of course the fourth member is India. Now, the Quad countries or the three other members of the Quad countries have, for instance, condemned China's aggression against Taiwan, but India hasn't. And it has invited some criticism from people in Taiwan, commentators in Taiwan and elsewhere. But India has to be cognizant of the fact that it has to deal with a belligerent China on the land border, and it is the only country among the Quad countries to face China so close or is faced off with Chinese troops. No other country, the US, the Australians or the Japanese face that dilemma, although the Japanese have a maritime dispute with China. So the challenge and the test for Indian policymakers, Prime Minister Modi, as well as the Foreign Office or the External Affairs Ministry, is to make sure that while it helps smaller countries, it helps them stabilize, it helps them not collapse under the weight of the uncertainty. It also has to make sure that China does not take advantage of these fragile economies and fragile countries in the neighborhood. I forgot to mention Myanmar, which is already under Chinese control more or less, because its dependence on China has increased after the military junta took over power last year. And again, India cannot afford to break off ties with Myanmar, but it has to balance it off in a manner that not too many of the instruments of state in Myanmar come under the Chinese influence. Similarly, there is this sensitivity in Bangladesh about how much aid Bangladesh can take from India and how China tries to force its way into Bangladesh. Nepal has been a ground of contestation between China and India for a long time, and that challenge remains. So that's where I think the Indian diplomacy as well as India's strategic policy establishment will have to be deft, will have to be on its toes, and will have to make sure that the countries around India does not go fully into the Chinese camp. Now that's a huge ask, because Chinese have deep pockets despite recession or near recession in their economy in the past at least a year or so. So therefore, what India needs to do is to strike a good balance between how it helps the smaller countries and how it keeps China at bay in these countries. And I think the Indian diplomats as well as national policy decision makers are good at it. But how does it pan out? One does not know over the next year and a half, when again elections, as I mentioned, will also take place in some of these countries. That's the challenge I wanted to point out to all of you who are going to listen to this program, and some of the guests who have joined us to discuss this subject. So that's where I will stop, but I will certainly take questions as this format permits. And I am told we have a viewer and somebody who's interested in policy as well as strategic affairs. Anil Gupta is joining us from Delhi, and I would like Anil to introduce himself a bit and then ask the question or discuss any comments that he has on the subject that I have mentioned. Over to you, Anil.
Good afternoon. Very well described situation in Indian subcontinent. I'm very clear that what you said is going to come out true. The concerns of Indian continent nations, which are our neighbors, are not only aid and defense oriented, but the difference in GDP, most of them are operating at minus GDP this year, and we are maybe likely to finish at 7 or 8% GDP. This is going to create more unrest in these countries, and I do not know how the people there will see, because they don't look to China, they don't look to the West, they look towards India for aid, as well as this difference in living standards and GDPs, which is going to stay here for at least 2 3 years more. I want you to
True.
respond to that.
That's true. Yes. Yeah, Mr. Gupta, that's a great observation, and I think good insight into watching the neighborhood. The whole issue here is that India has its limitations as far as financial aid is concerned, like you yourself mentioned. But there is a lot of goodwill India has amongst these countries. There are old civilizational ties, there are old cultural ties that are there between these countries. And that is the challenge. That while how do we preserve those ties, that relationship, and yet make sure that those countries or people in those countries don't feel as if we are doing them a favor. I think that's the big challenge for the Indian diplomacy and Indian bureaucracy, because they are they fiercely they take fierce pride in their independence, their own kind of existence as a separate nation. And therefore, India has to be very, very sensitive to how it projects its help in the way we give help to Nepal or to Bangladesh or to Maldives. And one way of doing it diligently and correctly is to complete some of the projects that India has undertaken in these countries in the past, say, 3 or 4 or 5 years. and make sure that they are completed on time, that there is delivery which is tangible and which is demonstrable, so that people know that India is there with them in thick and thin, through thick and thin, and therefore they don't go completely against India or Indian people. That's the only way I can see, because ultimately all countries have to really go through this cycle of economic downturn, hardships, poverty, and then finally come out on top, like Bangladesh has done after 71. But you're right, absolutely. There is no ready-made answer to this turmoil, and the way India has to tackle these countries' challenges, because they will look up to India, as I mentioned, because India is the big player, big power here. But that's going to be the challenge that Indian bureaucracy, Indian diplomats will face. And we'll have to watch. Maybe we'll have another program in 6 months or so to discuss where it has gone after we have discussed it here today in this program. Thank you very much for joining us. We also have another viewer joining us. If I can ask him to pose a question and also introduce himself before he asks a question or makes a comment.
My name is
Yeah.
Ayan Roy. I'm a student of Bluebell School International, and I have a question. What are the factors that are affecting Indian foreign policy? And I would like to add to that question, how does the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan affect Indian foreign policy towards China?
I think I'll take the second question first because it is more specific. Ayan, thank you for joining. Good to know that students are also interested in foreign policy and very early in their career. You see, Nancy Pelosi's visit is mainly a spat between the US and China. Taiwan is just an excuse or a medium. And there are, as I said, commentaries in Taiwanese press, elsewhere in the West, where they have criticized India for not joining the other three Quad countries in condemning China's aggressive behavior after Nancy Pelosi had departed from Taiwan. But India has its own reasons, and the foreign policy approach that India has taken vis-a-vis China in the context of what has happened in Taiwan because of Pelosi's visit is this, that India has a bilateral problem with China, which neither the US nor Australia nor Japan can come and solve or can intervene in the debate or the discussion between India and China. And therefore, it must take an independent position in doing what it is doing. It sees no value in joining joining the other three Quad countries and condemning Taiwan for condemnation's sake. It doesn't give them any dividends or any returns. That's why this is a very subtle kind of a policy that has been adopted by India. So that's the answer to your second part of your question. Now, the first part itself is very big and very, I would say, spread out, because how does Indian foreign policy look at itself in the coming, let's say, decade? Indian foreign policy has to be adaptive. It needs to be looking at other segments like not just international relations, but technology, technological sovereignty. Also make sure that development aspects in the Indian subcontinent, especially because neighborhood first is India's foreign policy, right? Under this government, and especially emphasized by this government. And of course, it has to also make sure that it strikes the right balance between India and its relations between Russia or with Russia and with the US on the other hand. So there is this big challenge, and it's never easy to constantly look over your shoulder that what is going to happen. Is the Ukraine war going to affect our fuel supplies? Is it going to affect our food supplies? We have a large population. So foreign policy is not just about summits and conferences and meeting in the United Nations, but also making sure that India's right image is projected abroad, and then through the policies and through interactions with other diplomats and other decision makers elsewhere in big and small countries, there is enough understanding of India. That is the big challenge for foreign policy mandarins, foreign policy bureaucrats, and of course the leaders who lead, like External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar. So that's where we are as far as Indian foreign policy is concerned. You can go on and on talking about it for a day when you talk about where is Indian foreign policy today and where is it going. But because of constraints of time, we'll have to end it here. Thank you both for joining me and asking these very perceptive questions. And I'm sure we'll have more audience coming in, but because we want to limit this time to a certain period, we thought we will not take any more questions. So do keep watching StratNewsGlobal and of course Ask Nitin, which is a new format that I have adopted after doing 100 episodes of Simply Nitin earlier. In this format, the idea is to exchange views with our viewers and our subscribers on YouTube, and of course get something substantial out of it as an outcome when we discuss some important issues. For the time being, I'm going to say goodbye. But don't forget to subscribe, or if you have not, if you have subscribed, tell your friends and family and acquaintances to subscribe to our YouTube channel. You know where to reach us for comments, and of course our social media handles are all visible on the screen. Do follow them so that we keep more engagement coming from the viewers, and the more interaction will lead to substantial outcome and more interesting thoughts coming out from people who interact with us and engage with us. Do not forget to watch a film that we have just recently released, a documentary film of 1 hour plus on Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, making haste slowly. It's on our YouTube channel. It is about how these two regions are progressing, not progressing, how are the people meeting their own aspirations, as the government succeeded in meeting their own aspirations or not. All this is captured in this film, done by our reporters who went to the ground and captured real emotions of people living in these regions of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. Do watch. It's worth your time, even if it's 1 hour long or 1 hour plus long. That is something that will give you an idea of what's happening in Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. So do watch that. And of course, do keep watching StratNews Global.